My name is Linda. This story happened when I was 46 years old. My son used to tell me everything. Every scraped knee, every grade, every silly joke his friends made at lunch, every song stuck in his head, he brought it all home to me like a gift, dropped it on the kitchen table between us, and waited for me to laugh or worry or hug him, whichever the moment called for. For 17 years, I was the first person he looked for when he walked through a door. I was a nurse, and I worked long shifts, and I raised him alone after his father died. But none of that ever felt like sacrifice, because at the end of every hard day there was Ethan, waiting up, wanting to talk. Then one summer, without any warning, I understood at the time, all of that stopped. He painted his room black. Not a corner of it, not an accent wall, all four walls, the ceiling too, until the room that used to be filled with soccer trophies and a keyboard he'd played since he was 6 looked like the inside of a closed eye. He dyed his hair the same color. He came home one afternoon with silver rings through his eyebrow and his lip, and he didn't ask me first. He just showed me, almost daring me to say something. He started wearing chains that clinked when he walked, heavy boots, shirts with band names I didn't recognize, and album covers that looked like nightmares. The music that used to drift from his room, soft piano scales, sometimes a pop song he was learning by ear, was replaced by something loud and distorted that shook the walls and made my chest feel tight every time I passed his door. And he stopped smiling. That was the part that frightened me more than the hair or the piercings or the music. My son had one of those smiles that made people feel like they mattered. The kind of smile that got him invited to every birthday party on our street. The kind neighbors mentioned to me at the grocery store. Ethan helped me carry my groceries in. What a sweet boy you have. That smile disappeared sometime in June, and I did not see it again for a very long time. I thought I was losing my little boy. That is the only way I know how to describe what those months felt like. Not that he was growing up, I understood growing up. I had watched other mothers go through it. The slammed doors and the rolled eyes, the ordinary friction of a teenager pulling away from his mother to become his own person. This felt different. This felt like someone had reached into my house in the middle of the night and replaced my son with a stranger wearing his face. I blamed his friends. I told myself it had to be them, some new group he'd fallen in with, kids who wore the same black clothes and the same hard, closed expressions, kids who had gotten to him somehow while I was working double shifts to keep our lights on and our refrigerator full. I convinced myself that if I could just cut off the source, if I could pull him back from whoever was pulling him away from me, I would get my son back. So I fought him. I told him he wasn't allowed to go to concerts anymore, not after I found a ticket stub in his jacket pocket for a show that started at midnight in a part of the city I didn't like the sound of. I went through his room while he was at school. I'm not proud of that, but I did it, and I threw away a box of things I decided were the problem. A poster, a few CDs, a jacket covered in patches that looked, to me, like symbols of something dark I didn't understand and didn't want to. I told him to wash the color out of his hair. I told him the piercings had to go before he was allowed back at church with me. I used the word normal more times that summer than I had in his whole life before it, as if normal was a place he could simply choose to return to if he loved me enough. It didn't work. Of course it didn't work. Every time I pushed, he pulled further away. He stopped eating dinner with me and started taking his plate to his room. He answered my questions in single words, if he answered at all. The door that used to swing open for me without a knock was locked more often than not, and when I did get in, he would just sit there, waiting for me to leave, his headphones still on, his eyes somewhere far away from mine. We went from a house full of conversation to a house of two people orbiting each other in silence, and some nights I would stand outside his door and listen to nothing at all and feel more alone than I had felt since his father's funeral. I want to be honest about what those weeks did to me. I cried in the bathroom with the water running so he wouldn't hear. I called my sister and asked her, half joking and half not, whether it was possible to lose a child while he was still living under your roof. I looked at old photographs, Ethan at the piano, Ethan hugging me before school, Ethan carrying an elderly neighbor's trash cans to the curb, and I could not reconcile that boy with the one down the hall who barely looked at me anymore. I told myself I had failed him somehow. Everything shifted on an ordinary evening that I almost didn't notice was shifting at all. I had come home early from a shift, tired in the particular way that comes from being on your feet for 10 hours straight, and I heard voices out on the front porch before I opened the door. One of them was Ethan's. The other was small, high, unmistakably a child's, the little girl from 2 houses down, 7 or 8 years old, who I knew sometimes waited outside for the school bus with her older brother. I stopped in the entryway instead of walking straight in, and I listened, the way mothers do when they hear their child's voice and can't quite bring themselves to interrupt it. "People think I'm scary because of how I look," Ethan was saying, in a voice so calm and so patient it didn't sound like the clipped, guarded tone he'd been using with me for weeks. "But that's okay. You shouldn't judge people that way. Not me, not anybody. You've got to look at what's actually inside somebody, not just what they're wearing or what their hair looks like." I stood frozen with my hand still on the doorknob. The little girl said something I couldn't quite catch, something about her brother saying Ethan looked like a monster, and I heard my son actually laugh, low and easy, and tell her that was okay too, that some people needed time, that it didn't mean she had to think that way herself. He talked to her for another minute about nothing important, about a cat that kept getting into her yard, and then he told her to get inside because it was getting dark, and I heard his boots on the steps, and I ducked back before he could see me standing there. I sat down at the kitchen table after he'd gone up to his room, and I didn't move for a long time. In all my weeks of looking at the chains and the boots and the black-painted walls, I had not once stopped to actually listen to my son. I had been so certain that the boy I loved had been replaced that I had missed, standing right there on my own porch, unmistakable proof he hadn't gone anywhere at all. The kindness was still there, fully intact, just wearing different clothes than I was used to. I didn't say anything to him that night, but something in me had cracked open, just slightly, and I found myself watching him differently over the next few days, not looking for what was wrong, but for what I might have missed. The second thing happened about a week later, and it frightened me before it humbled me. The school called on a Tuesday afternoon, and I saw the number and felt my stomach drop the way it always did lately whenever anything to do with Ethan showed up on my phone. I answered, already bracing myself, already rehearsing the conversation I assumed was coming in front. A suspension. Some fresh evidence that the boy I used to know was gone for good. But the principal's voice on the other end wasn't stern. It was careful, almost gentle, the way people sound when they're about to tell you something that doesn't fit the story you've been telling yourself. She told me there had been an incident a couple of weeks earlier involving a group of students and a freshman boy on the autism spectrum. A boy who ate lunch alone most days and struggled, she said, with the kind of casual cruelty that teenagers can inflict on anyone who seems different. A few boys had cornered him near the gym, mocking the way he spoke, knocking his books out of his arms, filming it on their phones to laugh about later. And in the middle of that, one student had stepped in, had physically put himself between the other boy and the ones tormenting him, had told them, loudly and without flinching, to leave him alone, had stayed with him afterward to help him pick his books up off the floor. That student was Ethan. I don't think I said anything for several seconds. The principal went on. She said that since then, some of those boys and their friends had started giving Ethan a hard time instead, spreading rumors, leaving him out, treating him the way they used to treat the boy he'd defended. She said she was calling partly to let me know what a fine thing he had done, and partly because she was concerned about how he'd been isolated afterward, and she wanted to know if we'd noticed a change in him at home. If we'd noticed a change. I almost laughed, except it wasn't funny. It was something closer to grief for all the weeks I had spent assuming the worst, building a whole narrative in my head about bad friends and bad influences, and a boy slipping away from me, when the truth was that my son had been quietly standing up for someone who couldn't stand up for himself, and had been paying a social price for it every single day, alone, without a word to me about any of it. I asked her why he hadn't told me. She said, gently, that a lot of kids don't. That doing the right thing doesn't always feel like something you want to announce, especially not to your mother, especially not when you're 17, and would rather she just think you're difficult than think you're some kind of hero. I hung up the phone and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time before I went inside, because I needed a few minutes before I could look at my son without my whole face giving away how wrong I had been. I didn't confront him with it, not directly, not that first day. Some instinct told me this wasn't something to force. Instead, I started paying closer attention, not policing him, just watching, The way you watch someone you're trying to see clearly for the first time in a while. Slowly, I began noticing all the small things the black clothes and the piercings had let me overlook. He still held the door for me without thinking about it. He still stopped to pet every dog on our street. He still, on the rare evenings we shared the kitchen, asked how my shift had gone before he said a word about his own day. None of that had changed. I had simply stopped looking for it. A few days after the principal's call, I was going through a box of old photographs in the hall closet, looking for a picture to send my sister for her birthday, when I found one I hadn't seen in years, Ethan at 5 years old, sitting on his father's shoulders at the county fair, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. I turned it over out of habit, the way you do with old photographs, hoping for a date written on the back. Instead, in my husband's handwriting, faded but still legible, there was a single line. Teach him to be kind, not popular. I sat right there on the closet floor with that photograph in my hands and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry all summer, not out of fear this time, but relief and shame and love, all tangled together. My husband had written that years before either of us could have imagined the black hair, the chains, the silence at the dinner table. He hadn't been asking for a son who looked a certain way or made the neighbors comfortable. He'd been asking for exactly the son I had. I had just been too afraid to see it. I understood, sitting there, that I had spent the entire summer terrified of losing my son, and that I had, in a way, lost something, just not him. I had lost the picture of him I'd carried in my head, the one with the soft smile and the pressed shirts, the one that felt safe because it was familiar. That boy had grown up, into someone who looked different than I expected. But underneath it all, he had never actually left. He had only changed his armor, not his heart. I went to his room that night for the first time in weeks without an argument prepared. I knocked, and he let me in, and I don't remember exactly what I said, only that I told him I'd heard about what happened at school, and that I was proud of him, and that I was sorry for the concerts I'd forbidden, for the things I'd thrown away without asking, for spending so much time trying to make him look like someone else instead of trying to understand who he already was. He didn't say much back. He's still 17, still my son, still a boy of few words most days. But something in his shoulders loosened, and for the first time since June, he looked at me the way he used to. A few weeks later, there was a concert, the band whose posters I had once thrown in the trash, the one whose music used to make the walls shake and my chest go tight. This time, when he mentioned it, I didn't say no. I asked if I could come. I bought a black t-shirt with the band's logo on it, the same one he wore, and when I put it on before we left the house, he looked at me for a long moment, and then he laughed a real laugh, easy and unguarded, the first one I'd heard from him in what felt like a very long time. We drove there together with the windows down, and I stood beside him in a crowd of black clothes and chains and loud, distorted music that I still didn't understand. And I watched my son come alive in a way I hadn't seen since he was small and playing piano just for the joy of it. He wasn't performing for me or against me. He was simply himself, fully, without apology, and for the first time all summer, so was I. Sometimes children don't change who they are. They only change how the world sees them. I wonder now how many other mothers are standing in a hallway somewhere tonight, listening to a closed door, mistaking their child's growth for their loss. I wonder what I would have missed if I had never stopped to listen. Would you have accepted your child just as they are?